What happens when the deadliest operators on the planet realize their biggest threat isn't the enemy, but their own generals? Picture 4 invisible men freezing on a high mountain ridge in Afghanistan, silently tracking hundreds of enemy fighters without making a single sound. They had the perfect trap carefully mapped out for weeks until a conventional army commander miles away decided he knew better. The catastrophic blunder that followed wasn't just a tragedy. It sparked the most heavily classified internal feud in modern military history. This is a story of stunning bureaucratic arrogance, and the exact moment Delta Force looked at the regular military and built a literal wall to keep them out. Why did Tier 1 operators forcefully lock decorated colonels out of their own shared bases? What terrifying reality did they face in the Shahi Valley that forced them to permanently break away from the big army? You are about to hear the raw, unfiltered truth about a secret war the Pentagon fought desperately to keep hidden. Stick with me until the very end, because the shocking insider details of this unprecedented military separation will absolutely blow your mind. Welcome to the ultimate frozen nightmare on Earth, the Shahi Valley in southeastern Afghanistan. The time was March of the year 2002, and the stage was perfectly set for an unprecedented, absolutely historic military catastrophe. Imagine a brutal, completely unforgiving hellscape surrounded entirely by jagged, razor-sharp mountain peaks soaring incredibly high, reaching well over 3,500 meters into the freezing, hostile sky. The relentless, howling wind at this extreme, punishing altitude does not just simply blow past a soldier. It violently slices right through modern tactical gear as if the expensive protective fabric does not even exist. The sheer lack of oxygen and the bone-crushing altitude violently drains away every single ounce of human physical strength and completely destroys basic mental judgment in a matter of mere hours. The valley floor itself is a treacherous, chaotic patchwork of ancient, crumbling irrigation ditches, winding dry riverbeds, and heavily fortified mud compounds that look exactly like ancient fortresses. It is a terrifying, inescapable natural fortress that provides absolute, unbreakable physical cover for absolutely anyone who deeply understands how to exploit its complex, dangerous geometry. The hostile Earth itself aggressively acts as a merciless, completely silent co-conspirator against any invading military force foolish enough to boldly enter its domain. This desolate, terrifying place was never just a simple battlefield. It was a colossal, geological, fatal trap, patiently waiting to swallow American forces whole and leave absolutely no trace behind. The landscape was a silent destroyer, completely indifferent to the massive, highly publicized technological might of the United States military machine. Every single rock, every single shadow, and every single frozen ridgeline in the Shahi Valley felt like it was heavily saturated with ancient, undeniable malice. The deeply hostile, completely freezing environment was practically screaming at the heavily armed American forces to immediately turn around and run far away. To successfully survive in an extreme, highly punishing place exactly like this, a military force absolutely must operate with the extreme precision and absolute silence of a highly trained surgeon wielding a razor-sharp scalpel. There is absolutely zero room for loud, arrogant, clumsy mistakes when the freezing air itself is actively trying to permanently stop your breathing. The highly experienced, deeply hardened special operators who secretly observed this vast, terrifying valley deeply understood that this was absolutely not a traditional battlefield designed for massive, incredibly noisy conventional armies. It was an incredibly delicate, highly destructive spiderweb, meticulously constructed by nature and patiently waiting for a loud, clumsy victim to stumble blindly directly into its dark center. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the imposing, jagged mountains made the incredibly powerful American military machine look absolutely tiny, fragile, and completely insignificant by direct comparison. But this terrifying geographical trap was only the very beginning of the unimaginable nightmare that was about to unfold. By the freezing late days of February in the year 2002, top-secret American intelligence made a genuinely spine-chilling, absolutely shocking discovery. Somewhere between 200 and 1,000 hardened, highly fanatical Al-Qaeda and Taliban extremists had successfully retreated directly into this mountainous grinder of men. These highly dangerous, deeply committed fighters were not just cowardly hiding from the enormous American military might. They were aggressively and systematically digging in for a massive, historic, and highly destructive confrontation. These fanatical extremists brought highly explosive, extremely heavy weapons with them and positioned every single gun with terrifying, heavily calculated tactical precision. They ruthlessly mounted massive DSHK 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns on the absolute highest, most dominating rocky ridges completely surrounding the entire valley. These horrific, devastatingly powerful weapons are specifically designed by engineers to completely chew through heavily armored helicopter fuselages at incredibly long, seemingly impossible distances. Furthermore, the heavily armed, deeply entrenched enemy had multiple massive mortar tubes already locked, fully loaded, and perfectly pre-registered on every single logical helicopter landing zone across the entire wide expanse of the valley. They were sitting in absolute, chilling, total silence, waiting patiently in the freezing cold for the arrogant, overly confident Americans to walk blindly right into their perfectly laid, highly explosive crosshairs. Every single inch of the rocky valley floor was heavily targeted, perfectly zeroed in, and totally ready to be instantly turned into a blazing, inescapable inferno of total destruction. The sheer, terrifying volume of completely hidden, highly explosive firepower pointing directly down into the valley was absolutely staggering and completely mind-boggling to fully comprehend. The fanatical, deeply committed terrorists had spent agonizing, highly calculated weeks perfectly burying their heavy weapons deep into the rocky, completely unforgiving mountain soil. They had meticulously calculated the exact, precise trajectories heavily needed to completely destroy any incoming American transport aircraft long before it could ever safely touch the freezing ground. These incredibly dangerous, highly motivated fighters possessed a deep, absolutely intimate understanding of the treacherous mountain terrain that no incredibly expensive, highly advanced American satellite imagery could ever possibly hope to accurately capture. They knew precisely where the massive, lumbering American transport helicopters would naturally want to attempt a landing, and they perfectly positioned their highly explosive, heavily destructive weapons to instantly annihilate those specific, highly vulnerable locations. The chilling, absolute reality was that the entire sprawling, rocky valley floor was absolutely nothing more than a giant, perfectly calibrated, completely inescapable zone of total destruction. Yet, the absolutely most shocking and terrifying threat did not come from the terrorist guns at all. It came directly from an American command tent. Enter Major General Franklin Hagenbeck, the powerful, highly decorated commander of the 10th Mountain Division, and his fatally flawed, incredibly dangerous masterstroke widely known to the world as Operation Anaconda. The official, highly classified plan aggressively drawn up by the conventional military headquarters looked like a beautiful, absolutely flawless textbook maneuver when viewed safely on a piece of clean paper in a deeply heated, highly secure room. The grand, sweeping, highly confident idea was to forcefully insert Allied Afghan militia forces at the extreme southern end of the valley to permanently block any possible physical escape routes for the trapped terrorists. Simultaneously, massive, heavily armed conventional infantry units would launch a grand, overwhelming, highly visible air assault directly into the northern end of the deeply hostile, freezing valley. The highly paid, heavily decorated generals confidently and arrogantly believed they could easily and cleanly squeeze the trapped enemy fighters directly between these two massive, completely unstoppable anvils of military might. However, this entire grand multi-million-dollar strategy rested completely upon a disastrous, completely crumbling foundation of completely false assumptions and incredibly dangerous, highly arrogant guesswork. The rigid, completely inflexible conventional planning machinery had aggressively committed to an incredibly strict, absolutely unyielding timeline, completely ignoring the terrifying, deeply brutal reality of the actual, highly hostile battlefield waiting for them. In the bloated, incredibly stubborn institutional culture of the regular conventional military, strictly meeting a completely arbitrary, highly unrealistic schedule was somehow vastly more important than the actual tactical survival of the brave young soldiers on the ground. The completely disconnected, incredibly arrogant staff officers, sitting completely comfortably in their heavily heated, deeply secure command tents back at the sprawling military base, simply looked at the complicated maps and saw a completely easy, almost effortless victory waiting for them. They completely failed to deeply understand that real, incredibly destructive warfare absolutely does not care about perfectly drawn lines on a piece of clean paper or highly optimistic, completely arbitrary bureaucratic schedules. The massive, incredibly heavy institutional momentum of the enormous American conventional military machine had taken complete, absolute control of the entire, highly complex, deeply dangerous operation. Once the highly decorated, incredibly powerful generals had confidently set the rigid, absolutely unyielding date for the massive daylight assault. Trying to change their deeply stubborn minds was exactly like trying to forcefully stop a massive, speeding freight train with your bare hands. The deeply frustrating, highly infuriating absolute truth is that the entire, incredibly dangerous operation was heavily driven by blind, arrogant bureaucratic momentum rather than actual, highly verifiable, deeply critical, tactical intelligence gathered from the actual ground. The ultimate sickening tragedy of this entire operation, the absolute truth was already sitting right there in the Pentagon's hands, and they simply ignored it. Long before the massive, absolutely deafening regular Army helicopters ever spooled up their roaring twin engines, the ultimate elite professionals were already silently operating deep inside the highly hostile frozen valley. Advanced Force Operations teams, heavily comprised of the absolute best, most highly trained Delta Force operators in the entire world, had spent agonizing, highly dangerous weeks completely infiltrating the highly guarded Shahi Kot area. These absolute, terrifying human apex predators walked directly into the heavily defended valley entirely on foot, operating completely in the pitch-black, freezing dead of night. They deliberately wore ragged, absolutely filthy civilian clothes, carried highly customized, heavily suppressed weapons, and moved with the absolute, terrifying, total silence of actual, invisible ghosts. These silent, highly destructive professionals meticulously mapped the entire sprawling, rocky valley in a flawless, highly detailed manner that absolutely no billion-dollar spy satellite could ever possibly hope to accurately replicate. What these incredibly brave, highly skilled men actually discovered completely and utterly shattered the comfortable, highly arrogant illusions constantly held by the disconnected conventional staff officers back at the completely safe, heavily guarded military bases. The dangerous enemy fighters were absolutely not clustered together at the bottom of the valley in an easy, highly vulnerable target. They were widely dispersed and heavily entrenched across multiple high-altitude, deeply freezing ridgelines. The highly fanatical terrorists had carefully prepared dozens of deeply fortified, highly dangerous fighting positions completely covering every single obvious physical approach. And the silent Delta operators already possessed the exact, highly precise, heavily classified grid coordinates for every single one of those destructive guns. These silent, incredibly proficient professionals of the elite Delta Force had spent their entire adult lives relentlessly, aggressively training for exactly this highly specific, incredibly dangerous type of unseen, shadowy, deeply secretive warfare. They absolutely did not rely on incredibly loud, massive armored military vehicles or highly visible, completely obvious military parades to forcefully assert their undeniable, absolute dominance over the battlefield. Instead, they relied completely on extreme, almost supernatural human patience, incredible, deeply honed stealth techniques, and a terrifying, highly accurate capacity for extreme, sudden, tactical action. While the massive, incredibly loud conventional army was still completely busy loudly planning their grand, highly visible, deeply arrogant entrance, the silent ghosts of the incredible Advanced Force Operations teams had already completely mastered the highly dangerous, completely unforgiving mountain environment. They had the absolute, undeniable, completely verified tactical truth literally resting right in their freezing hands, meticulously written down in highly classified, perfectly accurate intelligence reports. They possessed the exact, highly critical, completely undeniable knowledge that could have easily saved incredible, heroic American lives and completely prevented an absolute, highly publicized, massive military catastrophe. But what the bloated military bureaucracy actually did with this priceless, life-saving intelligence remains one of the absolute greatest scandals in modern warfare. This incredibly critical, absolutely life-saving intelligence meticulously gathered by the elite, highly trained operators was shockingly and disgustingly disregarded by the rigid, completely inflexible conventional command structure. This horrific, absolutely unbelievable situation was not just a simple, minor administrative oversight. It was a catastrophic, completely devastating structural collapse of the entire American military intelligence sharing apparatus. The flawless, incredibly precise tactical data produced by extraordinary men operating at the absolute razor edge of human physical and mental capability was blindly, arrogantly filtered through thick, suffocating layers of clueless, desk-bound staff officers. These arrogant, deeply comfortable bureaucrats had never once set a single foot inside the frozen, terrifying mountain valley, yet they shamelessly and boldly rewrote the undisputed reality of the battlefield to perfectly fit their own, comfortable, completely false narrative. The rigid, incredibly inflexible planning system aggressively prioritized their neat, tidy little timetables entirely over the brutal, completely undeniable ground truth established by the elite Special Forces heroes. The courageous, absolutely silent men who had literally risked everything they had to silently collect this priceless intelligence were violently forced to simply watch their vital work get completely minimized, arrogantly reinterpreted, and ultimately thrown straight into the bureaucratic trash. The grand, completely unstoppable conventional plan aggressively plowed forward like a completely blind, completely deaf bulldozer heading directly toward a steep, highly dangerous cliff, entirely ignoring the desperate, highly accurate warnings of the men who actually knew the terrifying truth. It is completely sickening and deeply infuriating to fully realize exactly how easily this entire, massive, highly destructive tragedy could have been completely and totally avoided. The incredibly brave, highly skilled men who silently froze on those deeply hostile, highly elevated ridgelines had completely done their highly dangerous, deeply classified jobs absolutely perfectly. They had systematically followed every single official, highly bureaucratic rule, formally submitted incredibly detailed, highly accurate reports, and explicitly, desperately warned the higher conventional command about the incredibly massive, completely hidden dangers perfectly lying in wait. But the incredibly thick, highly stubborn wall of massive conventional military bureaucracy forcefully and completely rejected their absolutely priceless, highly critical reality of the battlefield. It was an absolutely classic, deeply tragic case of arrogant, completely disconnected desk officers blindly believing they somehow knew vastly better than the deeply experienced, highly proficient operators who were actually looking directly at the deeply entrenched, highly motivated enemy forces. The massive, incredibly loud military machine completely chose blind, arrogant ignorance entirely over actual, highly accurate, completely verifiable tactical truth on the ground. The invisible countdown to absolute, undeniable disaster had officially reached zero, and the cold mountain sky was about to tear wide open. On the incredibly devastating, heavily anticipated morning of March 2, 2002, the massive, heavily armed elements of Task Force Raksan officially began their grand, sweeping air assault directly into the valley. This massive combined force, consisting of the elite 101st Airborne Division and the highly decorated 10th Mountain Division, flew straight into the highly fortified valley in broad, completely unforgiving daylight. They rode into battle in massive, highly visible, twin-rotor Chinook transport helicopters, with each colossal, incredibly heavy flying machine carrying up to 33 heavily armed, fully combat-loaded infantry troops. These enormous, completely lumbering transport helicopters are notoriously and undeniably among the absolute loudest, most incredibly noisy aircraft in the entire massive American military inventory. Their massive, chopping twin rotors violently generate a booming, deeply thudding, incredibly loud shockwave that aggressively echoes for unimaginable, sweeping distances across the rocky, highly amplifying mountain terrain. Long before the giant, heavily loaded helicopters ever came into actual visual range, the absolutely deafening, completely thunderous roar completely shattered the eerie, tense silence of the valley floor. The highly alert, incredibly patient Al-Qaeda observers posted high on the jagged, freezing ridges immediately sent the urgent, highly critical warning surging violently through their entire, highly effective human communication network. The sheer, deeply arrogant, completely undeniable noise of the conventional American operation practically handed the heavily armed terrorists 20 full minutes of precious advance warning to fully man their heavy, absolutely devastating guns. The sheer, completely undeniable arrogance of loudly flying, massive, incredibly noisy transport helicopters directly into a highly fortified, deeply hostile mountain valley during broad daylight is absolutely staggering to comprehend. The highly motivated, deeply entrenched enemy fighters absolutely did not need incredibly sophisticated, highly expensive radar systems to confidently track the massively loud, completely obvious American flight approach. All they absolutely had to do was simply listen to the incredibly loud, unmistakable, highly echoing thunder of the massive twin rotors bouncing violently off the towering, completely rocky canyon walls. In the highly delicate, incredibly unforgiving world of highly elite special operations warfare, absolutely every single precious second of complete, total surprise is incredibly vital to actual human survival. By aggressively choosing to loudly execute a massive, highly visible daylight air assault, the massive conventional military command completely and totally threw away the absolute most important, highly critical tactical advantage they actually possessed. They literally, forcefully handed the deeply entrenched, highly motivated terrorists the exact, precise warning they so desperately needed to completely destroy the incoming, highly vulnerable American forces before they even touched the dirt. In a brutal, unforgiving war where absolute surprise is the only true currency of human survival, the American Army had just incredibly loudly announced its own tragic disaster. The horrifying, completely devastating results of this highly arrogant daylight spectacle were immediately apparent, absolutely brutal, and completely catastrophic for the brave men violently involved. As the very first giant lumbering Chinooks flared their heavy noses to carefully attempt a landing, the cold mountain sky instantly erupted with incredible, viciously and violently tore straight through the thin, incredibly fragile metal of at least 3 separate heavily loaded helicopters in a matter of terrifying, absolute seconds. One specific, severely damaged helicopter, operating frantically under the official call sign Razor 01, was violently forced to instantly abort its desperate landing after taking catastrophic, highly critical damage to its main airframe. Meanwhile, another crippled, heavily targeted Chinook somehow miraculously managed to physically hit the hard dirt, only to tragically and horribly deposit its brave soldiers directly into a perfectly prepared, completely inescapable zone of total destruction. Terrified, highly confused men frantically scrambled off the metal ramps and instantly found themselves completely drowning in an apocalyptic, absolutely terrifying rain of explosive, highly destructive mortar fire. Within the very first agonizing, chaotic minutes of this grand, highly publicized air assault, hundreds of highly trained American soldiers were hopelessly and violently pinned down across the completely exposed, deeply hostile valley floor. They were brutally trapped, completely unable to advance a single inch, entirely cut off from any effective close air support, and suffering horribly in the freezing, completely unforgiving dirt. 7 heroic, incredibly brave American soldiers tragically lost their precious lives during the absolute, unimaginable chaos of Operation Anaconda, while dozens more unfortunately suffered horrific, highly life-altering, deeply traumatic injuries that would change their futures forever. The sheer, absolute horror and complete total panic of those first agonizing, highly explosive minutes on the freezing, deeply hostile valley floor completely defies all basic human comprehension. Incredibly brave, highly trained young American men suddenly found themselves violently thrust into an absolute, inescapable nightmare of screaming, highly destructive metal and violently exploding, deeply churning mountain earth. The grand, highly publicized, beautifully planned textbook military operation had instantly, completely, violently disintegrated into a desperate, highly chaotic, incredibly primal fight for basic, raw human survival. The deeply frustrated, highly capable special operators completely watching this massive, absolutely horrifying disaster violently unfold from their deeply hidden, highly secret elevated positions felt a cold, deeply furious rage completely wash over their entire being. They were violently forced to tragically watch their highly accurate, deeply verified intelligence violently ignored, their massive, incredibly quiet preparations completely destroyed, and their fellow, incredibly brave American soldiers tragically cut down in the freezing, absolute dirt. Right before the shocked eyes of the deeply concealed elite operatives, a horrific and bloody tragedy was violently unfolding, exactly as they had accurately predicted weeks prior. Instead of silently directing devastating airstrikes against key terrorist leaders, these invisible mountain ghosts were suddenly forced to frantically save a catastrophic, deeply flawed situation. The hidden, heavily camouflaged Advanced Force Operations observers from Delta Force took a desperate risk and deliberately exposed their highly secret, perfectly positioned sniper hides. They ruthlessly broke their strict radio silence to urgently scream for heavy close air support to save the trapped, heavily bleeding conventional Army infantrymen. These cold-blooded professionals intentionally sacrificed the outstanding results of long weeks of incredibly difficult secret work simply to rescue regular soldiers completely unprepared for this freezing mountain hell. It was precisely during these terrifying hours that a cold, fiercely calculating fury toward the arrogant Army leadership permanently cemented itself within the tight ranks of the Joint Special Operations Command. The elite operators bitterly realized that their flawless precision had been brutally destroyed merely to support a highly visible, completely reckless, conventional military parade. The true voice of this professional anger eventually emerged through Lieutenant Colonel Pete Blaber, the incredibly experienced commander of those exact forward forces during the brutal battle. In his highly revealing memoir, he meticulously dissected this fatal disconnect between the comfortable desk generals and the actual operators on the ground. Blaber had actively provided the highest military officials with absolutely exact, perfectly verified grid coordinates of every single hidden enemy fortification and detailed diagrams of hundreds of waiting extremist fighters. He had flawlessly executed his highly dangerous secret mission, practically handing the command structure all the incredibly necessary intelligence needed to plan a completely safe assault route. Yet the massive, stubborn bureaucratic machine simply ignored these priceless, life-saving facts, continuing to push forward with their fundamentally flawed, staff-driven scenario. This absolutely shocking reality became the loudest professional accusation against an inflexible system that constantly valued organized paper reports vastly more than the brutal truth of the deadly front line. The highest-ranking officers cowardly chose to completely close their eyes to stark reality, tragically condemning their own loyal men to a highly lethal trial by fire in a frozen, unforgiving foreign land. But this incredibly bloody disaster was merely the very first warning strike of a massive bell, hiding even more terrifying Pentagon secrets behind its deafening ring. To truly comprehend the staggering scale of this massive managerial catastrophe, one must deeply examine the deeply secretive mechanics of highly rigid conventional army planning. The massive traditional military machine operates strictly from the absolute top-down, where one highly ambitious commanding general dictates a broad idea, and hundreds of obedient officers blindly draw the deeply flawed details. Once a highly visible operation is officially approved at the absolute highest levels, it instantly acquires an unstoppable bureaucratic momentum, violently crushing absolutely any basic common sense in its path. Absolutely no deeply terrified staff clerk would ever dare politely approach a powerful multi-star general to honestly confess that his magnificent tactical vision is actually complete suicidal madness. The heavily enforced timeframes and the incredibly strict schedules quickly become untouchable holy doctrine, for which commanders are incredibly willing to cynically ignore any desperate warnings from their forward, invisible scouts. The typical bloated military bureaucracy simply does not know how to ever reverse course, even when a highly lethal stone wall of inevitable failure is clearly visible directly ahead. In the extremely harsh, completely merciless reality of the freezing Afghan mountains, strict operational security was absolutely never just a beautiful buzzword pulled from dusty military training manuals. It was the fundamental and irreplaceable factor that completely determined the terrifyingly thin line between a triumphant return to base and a massive, bloody tragedy. Absolutely any foreign, unnatural noise instantly transformed the most brilliantly equipped modern operation into a guaranteed, completely merciless death trap for naive soldiers. The fanatical, deeply entrenched enemy fighters absolutely lacked expensive satellite technology, but they were absolute geniuses at listening to their native mountains and masterfully weaponizing every single traitorous sound against uninvited guests. The absolute guarantee of keeping precious American boys alive in this completely wild terrain relied exclusively on the terrifying element of total, paralyzing surprise. Losing this deeply essential element meant the highly patient enemy instantly received a completely life-saving 20-minute head start to perfectly prepare their massive explosive cannons for a truly horrific welcome for the incredibly slow transport helicopters. However, the absolute greatest, completely earth-shattering shock was still waiting for the entire highly decorated Army elite, precisely when the deeply insulted Invisible Warriors decided to permanently rewrite the brutal rules of this highly deadly game. Merely a few highly furious weeks after those deeply tragic March events, the secretive leadership of the Joint Special Operations Command executed an absolutely unprecedented and completely shocking maneuver. Within the sprawling, chaotic confines of the massive Kandahar airfield, right in the absolute center of a bustling military metropolis, a completely autonomous, heavily sealed, and deeply mysterious complex began to rise incredibly rapidly. Extremely high, incredibly intimidating defensive bastions, heavily crowned with razor-sharp concertina wire, quickly grew completely around the elite Special Forces territory, rapidly transforming the entire area into a truly impenetrable dark fortress. They officially established only one single, incredibly strictly controlled entry point, completely physically blocking absolutely any uninvited, highly curious outsider from entering, regardless of the enormous number of shiny stars resting heavily on their general's uniform. Deeply hidden behind these mysterious walls operated powerful independent generators, highly autonomous water purification systems, and completely secure, deeply independent top-secret communication channels. The terrifying soldiers of the completely invisible front literally erected an incredibly impenetrable physical wall completely between themselves and the entire massive remainder of the armed forces, permanently severing their highly lethal operations from the incredibly clumsy army machine. To completely and accurately understand the true reasons behind this highly outrageous military audacity, one absolutely must know one incredibly crucial legal loophole that constantly drove regular Army commanders into states of blind rage. The highly secretive Joint Special Operations Command officially operated under completely exceptional legal authorities, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense and the absolute highest national leadership, completely bypassing all standard Army hierarchies. This absolute shocking reality meant precisely one thing: the highly important general formally commanding the entire massive theater of war possessed absolutely zero legal right to order these incredibly dangerous special operators to do anything. This completely outraged commander could only politely ask or angrily send long complaining messages back to the distant capital, but the terrifying Delta operators remained completely independent in every single lethal combat decision they made. This completely unique architecture of enormous, unchecked power allowed the incredibly elite soldiers to absolutely legally turn away high-ranking regular Army officers right at the heavy gates of their deeply secret fortress. The absolute feeling of complete autonomy rapidly transformed these highly specialized, incredibly dangerous killers into a deeply closed secret order operating entirely by their own completely unknown, incredibly brutal laws of the absolute hunt. But this incredibly aggressive isolation was completely driven not merely by professional arrogance. Heavily concealed behind those tall walls lay a truly chilling truth about the highly adaptive local enemy. The daily brutal reality of the completely unforgiving Afghan war mercilessly dictated incredibly harsh conditions to the frustrated military. Absolutely any secret information instantly spread incredibly violently across the vast valleys with the terrifying speed of an absolute consuming forest fire. Completely inconspicuous local observers, heavily armed with the absolutely cheapest mobile phones, watched incredibly carefully around the clock from absolutely every single dusty crossroad and every single highly elevated strategic mountain peak. Their daily task was terrifyingly simple, yet absolutely lethally effective. They visually recorded any slight movement of American military forces and instantly transmitted the highly valuable intelligence through a massive human chain. Of the massive base gates, it completely resembled an incredibly noisy, highly ridiculous, festive holiday parade. By the highly delayed moment, the heavily panting regular troops finally reached the specifically targeted remote village. The highly sought-after terrorist leader was already calmly drinking tea in an entirely different, incredibly distant province. The highly conventional army completely wasted enormous, staggering millions of dollars time and time again, constantly risking the precious lives of brave soldiers just to pointlessly drive heavily down highly dangerous mined dirt roads and return with absolutely nothing to show for it. In absolute, completely stunning contrast to this ridiculous conventional circus, the highly secretive night operations of the incredibly elite Special Forces looked exactly like the purest manifestation of terrifying, practically alien tactical competence. The absolute best elite special operations pilots in the entire world expertly utilized stunningly light, deeply agile MH-6 helicopters, brilliantly capable of flying precisely in absolute pitch-black darkness at extremely low, highly dangerous altitudes, blending perfectly with the treacherous terrain. The highly terrifying operators of the incredibly powerful Delta Force were always heavily equipped with completely innovative panoramic night vision goggles with 4 massive lenses, which forcefully granted them total tactical supremacy in conditions of complete zero visibility. These deeply rugged, incredibly dangerous men boldly departed on their crucial missions in completely inconspicuous, totally filthy civilian Toyota pickup trucks, sporting incredibly thick, unkempt beards and wearing traditional local clothing, completely dissolving into the deeply frightening night landscape. They wore absolutely zero shiny identification marks, completely lacked brightly colored army patches, and utilized absolutely zero roaring heavy military armor, relying completely on absolute chilling silence, terrifying invisibility, and lightning-fast lethal effectiveness. Their highly cunning, deeply concealed logistics ruthlessly and incredibly easily shattered the entire primitive early warning system of the tricky militants, aggressively allowing the silent operators to violently capture completely shocked targets directly in their warm beds long before they could even slightly consider absolute, terrifying resistance. The absolutely furious, predictable clashes erupted on the treacherous battlefield whenever conventional commanders attempted to aggressively dictate tactics to the elite operators. The traditional regular Army officers fiercely argued that establishing an outer security cordon naturally required incredibly massive, heavily armored vehicles overflowing with highly visible soldiers. From the purely academic perspective of a traditional military officer deeply trained in massive firepower doctrines, aggressively plugging every possible escape route with enormous force was completely logical. However, from the highly experienced, totally ruthless perspective of the silent Delta Force operators, this incredibly clumsy, deeply noisy argument was absolutely, completely, and fatally wrong. The fragile, entirely delicate architecture of a highly sensitive raid was built entirely upon the absolute, undeniable foundation of total, paralyzing surprise. The exact terrifying moment a highly observant local boy spotted a massive American armored truck and nervously made a fast phone call, the entire highly secretive operation instantly collapsed. The elite operators absolutely demanded a deeply rigid tactical solution they aggressively called the standoff, completely forcing any loud conventional forces incredibly far away from the deeply classified target. In frustrating actual practice, this meant fiercely ordering highly decorated regular troops to park their massive vehicles at least 500 full meters completely away from the objective. The totally insulted, highly annoyed conventional soldiers were strictly commanded to aggressively face completely outward into the dark desert, absolutely forbidden from even slightly observing the highly lethal operation silently unfolding behind them. Blindly wandered into the restricted area, blindly wandered into the restricted area. Absolutely everything else, every single terrifying room clearing and incredibly lethal close quarters engagement would be handled completely alone, entirely in absolute chilling silence by the ghostly assault element. But this bitter argument over basic tactical logic was merely masking a much darker, incredibly fast-paced, hidden evolution of the entire secret war. By the deeply complicated, incredibly dangerous middle years of the grinding conflict, the entire lethal tactical landscape had terrifyingly transformed into an entirely different kind of beast. The highly adaptive enemy was no longer just incredibly obvious foreign fighters violently stumbling through completely unfamiliar mountainous territory. They were now deeply localized, incredibly cunning militants who flawlessly disappeared completely into the innocent civilian population during the bright daylight hours. The incredibly expensive, massive conventional military intelligence machine deeply relied upon completely tracking easily intercepted mobile phone signals to confidently locate these elusive targets. But the incredibly smart, deeply paranoid enemy commanders had incredibly swiftly adapted, completely abandoning their highly traceable phones entirely. They aggressively reverted entirely to ancient, completely invisible human couriers and totally untraceable underground financial transfers to completely hide their lethal movements. The brilliant, ruthless special operations answer to this terrifying intelligence blackout was a completely massive, highly accelerated targeting cycle famously known strictly as find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze. The completely unprecedented, absolutely shocking element was not the basic concept itself, but the terrifying, highly unheard of, pure speed at which the elite operators aggressively executed it. When these terrifying men violently cleared a secret compound, the highly valuable intelligence discovered, like captured pocket notebooks and completely hidden electronic devices, was completely analyzed within mere hours. This precious, newly discovered intelligence immediately and violently fed directly into generating the highly precise, incredibly deadly exact coordinates for the completely next highly destructive target. The incredibly slow, deeply bureaucratic targeting cycle that previously took agonizing, frustrating days to complete was now incredibly being compressed into just a few completely terrifying, absolute hours. This blinding, incredibly lethal operational speed simply could never practically exist if the highly agile special forces were forcefully chained to the massive regular army. A deeply traditional conventional operation required agonizing, highly complex legal reviews and massive intelligence confirmation from totally endless, redundant administrative layers. These completely massive, deeply exhausting command approvals at the brigade level routinely dragged out for an incredibly frustrating 72 long, completely agonizing hours. In an incredibly dangerous, highly fluid environment where a sought-after enemy leader might completely change his exact physical location multiple separate times in one single day, 72 hours was a completely disastrous eternity. Operating completely under highly classified legal authorities, the elite special operations machine could violently launch a fully lethal raid in comfortably under 2 absolute hours. Integrating absolutely any highly visible, incredibly slow, conventional military elements into this perfectly tuned, highly lethal engine would have instantly destroyed its absolute speed. And the absolute pure core of this deeply terrifying, highly independent, lethal speed was completely hidden entirely behind the impenetrable, high walls of their incredibly secretive compound. The highly classified, completely enclosed Delta compound sitting directly inside the massive Kandahar base operated entirely as an incredibly bizarre, completely parallel universe. Extremely rare visitors who actually managed to step directly inside the deeply intimidating walls frequently described an incredibly focused reality entirely separate from the massive conventional war outside. Absolutely zero completely ridiculous morning formations, entirely no incredibly annoying administrative lines at the huge base dining facility, and absolutely no highly traditional military nonsense existed completely inside. The entire completely secret facility aggressively breathed at a totally different, incredibly lethal rhythm entirely dictated exclusively by the completely ruthless, incredibly fast-paced targeting cycle. The incredibly dangerous assault elements completely slept heavily through the highly bright daylight hours and violently hunted entirely exclusively within the pitch-black night. The deeply hardened operators ferociously protected their absolutely vital, highly fragile local intelligence sources with a terrifying intensity that bordered on absolute, total paranoia. Or they absolutely deeply understood that utilizing the highly porous, completely enormous conventional military communication networks would instantly cause a highly deadly intelligence leak. The deeply insulted, highly decorated regular generals were politely but incredibly firmly completely turned away right at the tightly locked gate. This entirely absolute, incredibly stunning, deep divide was completely visually confirmed by the completely wild, highly terrifying physical appearance of the deeply hardened operators themselves. These incredibly seasoned, totally lethal men confidently walked straight through the massive conventional bases, completely sporting incredibly thick, unkempt beards that had been wildly growing for many long months. They wore completely filthy, highly dusty civilian clothing straight over their highly customized tactical gear, absolutely lacking entirely any shiny rank insignia. They totally, completely looked absolutely nothing like highly traditional American soldiers, completely appearing precisely like an entirely different, incredibly terrifying breed of highly dangerous human being. This totally shocking, incredibly wild physical appearance was itself an absolutely highly brilliant, completely devastating tactical weapon. It totally prevented the highly observant enemy from ever accurately predicting their entirely unexpected, completely silent movements. The deeply clever enemy commanders simply possessed absolutely no effective mental framework to completely understand or successfully counter heavily armed ghosts. These completely silent killers constantly arrived flawlessly in incredibly dirty civilian trucks at precisely 3 in the absolute morning. However, despite this completely absolute tactical brilliance, a deeply uncomfortable, highly undeniable truth completely hung heavily over the entire incredibly lethal shadow war. The incredibly fast, absolutely brilliant targeting cycle could completely eliminate specific enemy commanders with absolutely terrifying, unmatched precision. The highly elite operators constantly dismantled highly dangerous terrorist networks night after completely terrifying night. Yet the completely frustrating, entirely undeniable reality completely remained that the highly adaptable enemy network constantly, completely, violently regenerated itself. The incredibly resilient Taliban network, deeply rooted entirely in ancient local tribes and completely heavily funded by totally illegal narcotics, simply replaced the violently removed nodes. This was absolutely not a completely tragic failure of the incredibly brave special operators. It was a completely massive, highly strategic, absolute failure by the completely distant politicians entirely, failing to completely understand the true brutal nature of the war. The incredibly heroic men highly brilliantly, flawlessly executed their incredibly dangerous missions, completely unable to entirely fix a highly flawed, massive national strategy. In the absolute, completely dark end, the entirely true, highly terrifying legacy of these completely silent warriors is written completely in the absolute deep shadows. They built incredibly thick physical walls absolutely not out of entirely massive, blinding professional arrogance. They entirely aggressively built them completely out of absolute, total, completely brutal necessity for absolute survival. Their incredibly highly secretive, completely terrifying absolute war completely happened entirely away from the highly massive news cameras. It was completely an entirely, absolutely legendary, deeply, highly terrifying campaign of completely total, entirely silent violence. The absolute, deeply, completely terrifying, entirely absolute truth of the frozen Shahi Kot Valley completely changed the entirely absolute future of highly secret warfare, completely, entirely, forever. This totally incredibly detailed, entirely completely shocking, absolute account is entirely deeply verified completely by the incredibly highly explosive absolute memoirs of completely actual, highly respected special operations, absolute commanders, entirely, completely, directly involved.